This conference will now be recorded.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another segment of College Knowledge Night. We're lucky enough tonight to have Owen Bligh with us. He's the Dean of Admissions at Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island. And tonight's topic is going to be all around the financial aid process. So we know it can be kind of stressful. So we have the expert here to talk about it. So Owen, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the invitation, and glad I can kind of join you all this evening. As was mentioned, my name is Owen. I'm the Dean of Admission at Providence College. I thought it would be kind of helpful just briefly to give a quick introduction to Providence, so you understand kind of where some of the perspectives when it comes to financial aid are coming from. But we're an institution of roughly about 4,200 students, divided up into four different schools. So programs ranging from arts and science to business, education, social work, nursing, about 54 different majors total, and a school that's growing, have typically been about 4,000, but 4,200 now, and in about 2 years we'll be at about 4,500. The kind of main thing that's distinctive about us, which certainly you'll be familiar with, is that we're the only college in the country that's run by the Dominican Friars, and so that is a point of really pride for the institution, and a big part of our students' experiences. We're fortunate to have about 45 friars who live right on campus, about half teaching and half in more administrative roles. But they do a lot to really build the community feel around here, and that's a big part. The community comes from the size. I mean, we're the smallest school in a major athletic conference, and really that sense of kind of belonging that many students have is really a great point. We're lastly just located in the city of Providence. So for those who are not familiar, capital of Rhode Island, about 5 minutes from downtown Providence. So we are about 45 minutes south of Boston, and just a few minutes from downtown Providence. So very kind of traditional campus, and then you have the city right there. So that's a little bit about Providence. But for the rest of this, certainly I will maybe let you know the way that we do some things, because it's common elsewhere, but this is going to be more general, an introduction. So over the course of tonight, we're going to talk about kind of when you should apply for financial aid, and how to start that process, what it means when we're calculating what's called financial need. We'll talk about the different types of need-based financial aid that a student and family can be eligible for, talk about how that calculation of need turns into a net price, and how to compare offers across different institutions. And not part of the need-based aid conversation, but certainly a part of kind of affordability and managing the costs of a college education. We'll talk about merit-based scholarships, and then finally leave you with some tips and advice that I have and worked through this process for a number of years. The chat is available. If you have any questions kind of as we go, we'll take those towards the end. But I know that both Mandy and Tony are going to kind of help out as the session goes on. With financial aid, always just kind of emphasize to avoid specifics. A lot of times it's hard to give answers about financial aid, because without having all the family information in front of you, it can seem a little vague. But certainly questions about the process in general we'll talk about. And so let's dive kind of right into it. I think as Tony kind of mentioned in the intro, it's fair to say that this is not everyone's favorite part of this process. Visiting campuses is great. Beginning to write your essay and get all of your kind of thoughts into the Common App, that's a really enjoyable part. Filling out the FAFSA, not great, not exciting, but just as important. And so we'll talk about kind of why that is as we go along. But to start off with kind of the two different application forms. So there's really two of them. There's the FAFSA, which is the federal application. This is a form that you will need at pretty much every institution you're going to. It's what's used to distribute federal financial aid, and at a number of institutions, it's what they use to distribute their own institutional aid. And so you'll hear a lot about the FAFSA, and we'll talk later in this session about the ways that the FAFSA has changed, and also some of the things that are kind of calculated within it. But you're also likely going to hear about a secondary financial aid form, and that's called the CSS profile. The CSS profile is a College Board product that is used by several hundred institutions, and they're institutions that use it to award money from their endowment. So usually institutional grant. So there aren't loans coming from it. There aren't any of the work study opportunities or federal programs, but these are kind of being used to calculate eligibility for institutional grant. And so at Providence, that's where the majority of our financial aid comes from. We participate in all the federal programs, but as a private institution, our total cost of attendance is just over $80,000. And so the bulk of our support comes through the CSS profile. It also looks at things differently, which we'll talk about in a moment, the kind of differences between them. But the FAFSA calculates things kind of consistently across the country. So we'll talk about the output of that. But the CSS profile allows schools to kind of look at what matters to them. So for us, the CSS profile at times, we can do different weightings of assets and retirement plans, different pieces like that. Some schools will consider younger students who are maybe in a private elementary or secondary school environment. It lets us factor in the cost of living where someone is coming from, even lets us consider kind of how close a family is towards retirement age and maybe give some concessions towards that. And so two forms, equally important if the profile is somewhere, if it's a requirement at one of the institutions that you're going to apply to. When it comes to the deadlines, the CSS profile is open right now. Its official kind of open date is October 1st. They actually got it open a few days earlier this year. And so you can begin to work on that. Now, I'll caution you right now, if you are a senior in high school, you want to be filling out the 25-26 CSS profile. Our office, we have already received dozens of 24-25, and those are for students who are enrolling this year. So you want to apply with the form that's based off the academic year you'll be enrolling. So if you're following the kind of traditional schedule where the majority of students are, and you're applying for admission in the coming months, and you're planning to enroll in the fall of 25, you're going to want to be doing the 25-26 financial aid forms. CSS profile is open. The FAFSA has been delayed a little bit. That should open around December 1. That's the date that we have right now. What I'll kind of add in general, whether FAFSA or profile, it's really important to look at each school's deadlines and make sure that they're submitted by those deadlines. This is a process that happens at the same time as the admission process. So when you submit your common application, we start reviewing it, and we have many to go through. But our colleagues in financial aid, they also start reviewing financial aid applications. And it may be that student isn't admitted and their review is all for nothing, but these two processes happen at the same time. So I would strongly encourage you to not wait until you find out about whether you've been admitted to one place or not to then engage with the financial aid process. You'll also find that many of the financial aid deadlines are before the notification date for admission. The other thing is that the financial aid deadlines wildly vary in a normal year, which I'll talk about some of the FAFSA things in just a moment, which if you watch the Today Show or read the newspaper, I'm sure you've kind of heard a little bit about them. But in a normal year, the financial aid deadlines vary. This year, probably more so. And it's likely they could even change from maybe a handout that you were given on a campus visit in July or an email that you got in late August. And so continually check the financial aid websites at the institutions that you're applying to and make sure you're staying on top of those. no one is trying to kind of like penalize students or catch you having not applied, but a lot of times when institutions might be working with limited resources, they do have to prioritize those who submitted everything on time. So staying on top of deadlines is really a key consideration. So I mentioned there's the FAFSA and the CSS profile. Those are the two main forms, and for the majority of students going to college, it's only the FAFSA, but I think it's important to talk about both. But let's start by diving in on the FAFSA. So FAFSA stands for the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. The process has changed a little bit. So last year the FAFSA was overhauled, and I'll talk about kind of the changes and from the standpoint of what matters to them, but also the process has changed. So if you have an older student who maybe went through this 2 or 3 years ago, it's a little bit different now. It all starts with making an FSA ID. And so students and parents can create their studentaid.gov account at any point. And you must have that account to sign the FAFSA form, which is kind of at the end of submitting all your information. That is how you get it submitted. And electronically is definitely the faster and best way to do it. I would, unless you have a circumstance that requires it, I'd strongly avoid using the paper version of the FAFSA. But that FSA ID is a requirement, and you can do it at any point. You don't need to wait until your FAFSA is ready or anything like that. Important to know, if a parent is going to be a contributor on their student's FAFSA form, then the student and the parent need separate studentaid.gov accounts. So one each. So only one parent needs the account, even if there's two parents in the picture, and both info will be used on the FAFSA form. But if there's parent information and there's student information, you're going to need two accounts. The student is going to need one to sign the FAFSA, and then the parent is as well. Things have changed with regard to kind of how data is obtained. So the FAFSA now is actually largely filled out through a direct link to the IRS. So you'll see that DDX, the Direct Data Exchange, you will be giving consent to FAFSA to contact the IRS, and it all happens digitally. But you'll be given consent to draw all that information in, so they have the most kind of accurate information that is available. I'll talk a little bit about the kind of changes that have happened, but I think it's also important to briefly mention kind of who is eligible to receive financial aid. So as I mentioned in the beginning, the FAFSA is to distribute federal aid at its core. Some institutions use it for institutional, but at its core, it's for federal financial aid. And so who is eligible to receive that? U.S. citizens or U.S. nationals or eligible non-citizens. You must have a high school diploma or the equivalent. You have to be going to an eligible degree or certificate program. You must be kind of like enrolled as a student in those programs. You need to have a valid social security number here. And in broad terms, you need to be making satisfactory academic progress. And so this is something more for returning students in later years. But I think it's important to kind of share who can fill out and who cannot fill out the FAFSA. But there's a full list of eligibility requirements at the link that I put on that slide. All right, I mentioned some changes, and I think when it comes to the understanding the methodology that goes into kind of FAFSA, this is the easiest place to talk about it. These letters probably won't mean anything unless you had someone else go through this process in the past years, but EFC has become what's called the SAI. And so I will talk about kind of how this factors into the calculations a little bit later. But EFC for a long time stood for the estimated family contribution. It was essentially the government saying, this is what we think you have the ability to contribute towards college. That has gone away. What now exists is the SAI. It's the Student Aid Index. It's an index number that is calculated in a similar way using information that the student and the contributors, which is usually parents, provide on the FAFSA form. But the SAI can now range from almost negative $1,500 up to about $1 million. So it's not a dollar amount, and so you won't receive kind of the student aid report as you did in the past. You'll receive something different that basically puts you on an index of how much you should be kind of eligible for. Parental contributions have changed. The parent who provided the most financial support for the student over the last 12 months is now the FAFSA contributor. And so if this parent is remarried and didn't file their taxes jointly, then their spouse will also be a contributor. So in the past years, the FAFSA has used the financial aid information of the parent who the student lived with the majority of the time, regardless of whether they provided the most financial support or not. That is no longer the case. And so this gets very complicated because it's asking kind of who has contributed the most financially. And so the best place to figure this out, if you do have kind of a situation where this may come into play, they have a website, studentaid.gov/dependency. And there's 4 or maybe 5 questions that will be asked that will tell you exactly who it is that is expected to be contributing to that student's education. It's a significant change this year. So if you are in a situation where there's legal guardians or divorce, remarry, step parents, I would definitely recommend looking into this a little bit more closely. The Pell Grant, here's some good news with the FAFSA change. The Pell Grant is expected to grow significantly. So almost 600,000 students from low-income backgrounds who were not eligible under the previous FAFSA, they will now be eligible, and about 1.7 million will receive that maximum amount of their Pell Grant. So a good change there. I don't mean to instantly go back to like bad news. But there's no longer a consideration for the number in college. So I'm going to use very, very round numbers for this. But with the old FAFSA, say the cost of attendance is $80,000 and you do the FAFSA and it says you can contribute $50,000. If you had 2 students in college at the time, it would say 25 to student 1 and 25 to student 2. So 25 out of 80 and 25 out of 80. It no longer factors in that there's multiple children in college at the same time. So in the past, where it would be 25 per child, and this is overly simplifying it, but the point remains, it is now 50 per student. So 50 out of 80 and 50 out of 80. This is in the federal formula. Institutionally, schools can do kind of what they want. I understand the arguments on both sides of it. At Providence, we felt it was going to be really difficult to ask families to kind of to come up with this extra money. So we are an institution where we still consider the number in college. If you have 2 enrolled in college at the same time as undergraduates, we're dividing that contribution in half. But from a federal standpoint, that does not happen. And so that's an important thing to kind of keep in mind as we go forward. And then the big thing, kind of the reason they started all this FAFSA changes was to make it simpler. So now it's about 18 questions compared to in the past, students could have to answer almost 103 questions. So that's the FAFSA. That's the main form that's used by pretty much every college. As I mentioned in the intro, there is also the CSS profile. So a quick kind of recap on that. It's a College Board product. you use the same kind of logins and passwords that you did when you registered for the SAT. Make sure you're doing the correct year. So if you're enrolling in fall 25, you want 25, 26. This form does have a fee. So there is a fee associated with filing it, but if your annual income is under 100,000 per year, you're automatically granted a fee waiver for it. Institutions can give additional fee waivers. Providence does not. We follow just kind of the methodology that they have. We give fee waivers for other things, but for CSS profile, we do not. But that doesn't mean everywhere doesn't. So don't be hesitant to ask if a school has a fee waiver for the profile. I forget the exact cost. I want to say it's like $20 for the first one and then $10 for each subsequent. CSS profile it's more complicated. It is not as short as the FAFSA because it's asking a lot more questions. The other part of it is they do offer what's called IDOC. So many institutions will require you to submit student and parent W-2s, tax returns, business tax returns, all the schedules for businesses that you may own. IDOC is kind of a subservice of CSS profile that allows you to do that. Again, this is something we don't participate in it. We have a portal where students can upload everything, but important to be aware that this is a thing that is out there. And for the schools that do it, it's nice because you only have to upload things once and it'll go out to the 4 or whatever CSS profile schools that you're applying to. So these are the two kind of main forms. There may be other ones. Some states may have special forms for different grants and stuff like that, but really these are the two main ones that institutions are going to be using. And so you submit them, and a financial aid counselor kind of gets to work. And what is calculated is what we call your financial need. So it starts with cost of attendance. This is what everything is built off of. So you're going to see a term called cost of attendance, which could include tuition and fees, and housing and meals. For anyone who's done this before, we used to call that room and board. Now it's called housing and meals. It's a very literal term for it. Those are probably the billed things, but cost of attendance is more than just your billed expenses. So it could also include like books, supplies, insurance, any fees that go along with your major. Like we have a fee for nursing majors to assist with the technology they need to get them a stethoscope, all that sort of stuff. So all of that is built into cost of attendance. Transportation. So for example, like transportation costs for a student from Massachusetts, we add $50 in. A student from Texas, we add more because you have to fly here. So all of those things are built into cost of attendance. And cost of attendance is what an institution says it will reasonably cost you to attend here. It's not what we're going to bill you, but it's kind of the all-in price by which we build an aid package around. Then we have the student aid index, or the kind of institutional calculation of the contribution. So the student aid index is, even though it's not a dollar amount, technically everyone uses it in this way. It's basically kind of like, what do we think you should be able to contribute towards it? And that's kind of a general way. When you're talking institutionally, that's exactly it. We calculate kind of what we think a student should be able to, and student and others who are contributing should be able to contribute towards their education. Now, this is where I'm going to pause for a little bit, because I don't think there's anyone who works in financial aid who believes or tries to argue that the number that's calculated is always accurate. It's kind of what assets, what savings, what retirement, everything all in, saying this is what you can kind of contribute towards education. And so this number, you can ask for it from an institutional standpoint. We can tell you what we think it is, and you'll see it on the aid report that you receive after submitting the profile. But there's kind of also a little bit of a conversation of like ability versus willingness. And that's something that's important to consider. And we'll talk about comparing different aid packages in just a moment. But this number that comes out is not, it makes sense, but it's oftentimes not as realistic for a number of families as they think. But basically, to get back on track, this number is developed, and so we have the cost of attendance. Then we subtract basically what we think it is that you can contribute, and that results in your financial need, which is basically, here's our costs. We subtract what you contribute, and your financial need is kind of what is left, what needs to be kind of like closed to then to have the bill satisfied. And so the goal is to kind of have schools meet 100% of the need. The difficult thing there is that there are not many schools that do it. And so when your need is not met, that's what's referred to as a gap. And so when you receive different financial aid packages from different institutions, you may see that they vary widely. And that's because there are so few institutions that kind of meet the full demonstrated need of a student. What I would say, you'll start to see this as you kind of go through the process and receive packages. There's a way to get a ballpark idea, and I didn't ask Tony or Mandy in advance. I don't know if this is all seniors or if there's juniors in here, but even if you're a senior, it could be really helpful to do. I put in the bottom left two kind of like tools. Well, I guess the name of one. The aid estimator, a student of any age can use this. So that's why I mentioned about juniors. This can be a really good way to provide an early estimate of aid eligibility, so you can plan ahead. Or even if you just kind of you're not ready to do, well, you can't do the FAFSA yet because it opens December 1, but if you just want to get an idea of what federal aid eligibility looks like, it'll ask for information like your earnings and taxes and provide an estimate for the federal student aid programs. The second thing I put there is a general term. It's called net price calculator. There was a law, it was a while ago now, like 10, 12 years ago, that was passed that required every college to put on their website what's called a net price calculator. And so we have one on our website. You plug in all your information, and it gives you an eerily close estimate to what your aid package is going to be. We actually, about 2 weeks ago, we just loaded in about 6,000 financial aid packages from the previous class, and it models them all out, and it uses that to understand kind of how we package. And so net price calculator is a really good idea if you're early in the process to get an idea, maybe like at a private institution, at different places, kind of what you think your costs could look like. Where I think it's especially valuable is if you're thinking about applying early decision somewhere, which this isn't an admission session, but early decision is the binding one. So you know it's your first choice. You want to apply ED because that may hold a little bit of an advantage. And not that a school is going to like hold you to it, but for example, we usually fill about 30% of our class through ED, and we released 2 students last year because we were looking at the numbers and they were looking at the numbers. If you're thinking ED somewhere, or if you're earlier on in this process and just want an idea of how affordable a school may be, then the net price calculator could be a good tool for that. When you do it, you're going to kind of get a sample aid package, and there's going to be a couple different things kind of that are in there. There are many different types of need-based financial assistance that are available. So scholarship is one. These do not need to be repaid. They're usually based on academics or athletics, and I'll give you some more tips on scholarship towards the end. There's typically some sort of agreement that's a part of them. And they can also be not from the institution, but from outside sources as well. So there's a number of like large companies, or even better, like community organizations. If you have like an American Legion or a Moose Club or any of those like community organizations, Rotary Club, a lot of them have scholarship programs. Those would be a kind of great place to look. So that's kind of a type of assistance that usually isn't considering need, though sometimes it is. But really the ones that are similar to scholarships in the sense that you don't have to repay would be the grants. So in the top right, you can see grants. They're sometimes called gift aid. You may have heard that term. Those are based off the results of the FAFSA and CSS profile. You have to reapply for them each year. So that's how they're different than a scholarship. Each year, based off the family situation, you're going to be reevaluated. And so if everything stays the same, then I guess I can only speak for us here, but they're going to stay consistent. Your aid package shouldn't change. But if you do like maybe have a sibling who graduates at a school where they're still considering the number in college, that could have a significant impact. Or if you have a one-time income, anything that kind of swings things. But to get back to grant, so it's not guaranteed all 4 years. You'll have maybe some schools that will, those that have like the guaranteed price lock or something like that. But really, it's not terribly common. Most of the grants going to change year to year, as your need-based aid does. And then there's also loans. So there are the loans that are part of the financial aid package. So direct student loans, they can be subsidized or unsubsidized. The difference there is whether they're accruing interest during the time you're in college, but they are loans. They come directly from the federal government, so the rates are typically some of the most competitive ones. I always recommend taking the federal ones before looking to private ones, though there's nothing wrong with private loans, and can answer questions about those after if you want. But the federal loans usually have a lower rate. You'll see a lot of times that there could be forgiveness with them. Certainly, that's a conversation politically now, but there's a number of programs beyond that. There are some for public service, so people who go into education or social work or anything that's kind of benefiting the community. There's a lot of forgiveness programs. Those aren't going to forgive private loans. They only forgive the federal ones. So that's why I always start with kind of the direct ones. They're also good because they're taken out in the student's name. So the student's the borrower, the Department of Ed is the lender, and they have a low interest rate, as I was mentioning. So the total of those for the next year, it's $5,500 that you can take out in direct student loans. The split between subsidized and unsubsidized varies based off the result of the application. The other federal program, which I didn't put on here, but that would be the Pell Grant. I didn't put it here because we talked about it before. That goes up to about $7,400 per year. So those are kind of the two big federal ones. Then there is also work study, and work study is really important. And so I'm going to caution you on something, but don't take it as a negative. Just take it as kind of like a piece of advice. Work study will oftentimes show up on financial aid packages, but they are not going to be it's not going to be something that's like deducted from the bill. It's funds that are earned by the student at a job that almost all the time is on campus that helps the student pay towards their education. And so it's almost like wages. It doesn't have to be repaid. It's not a loan, and the nice thing is that it's not taken into account when factoring in for financial aid next year. So you can still work another job and not worry about your income going up or anything like that. But they really are a good kind of option for working. Typically, you're working about 8 to 10 hours a week on campus. But it's important to know that a lot of times they'll show up on a financial aid letter, but they're not going to be deducted right from the bill. So I encourage you to kind of leave it out of the calculations when you're looking at affordability. So these are all the different pieces. And then what will happen is you will receive financial aid packages. A lot of times they will follow offers of admission. You'll sometimes see them at the time admission is offered, but especially in some of the earlier rounds, you'll see them happen a few weeks later. But you'll find kind of in whatever portal or system it is that the school has to release a letter similar to this one, which our costs have changed. This screenshot I took is couple of years older, but basically it starts at the top. You see the cost of attendance, which I talked about, all the different things that get factored into that. So that's your sticker price. Then in the middle, we do ours in a way where we put grants and scholarships, anything you don't need to repay in one part. Then you'll see if there's any outside scholarships and then loans. And so that results in kind of what we call the net price. And so a caution here is that net price is not like universally calculated. Providence calculates it as your direct cost minus grant, scholarship, outside aid, and student loans. But some places will maybe not include loans in that, or they may do your net price as just the cost of attendance, not just the direct costs. And so until there is, which I don't think is ever going to happen, but until there's a way that these are kind of standardized, and there's 16 different standards that we all need to follow, but it's not enough to kind of keep the math even. So I recommend kind of getting your own Excel kind of worksheet, and there might be some online, but really kind of doing the math on your own and figuring out what the bottom line cost of attendance is. Because for cost of attendance, you may see that I mentioned how we factor in the cost of like flying from Texas to Providence. Another school may not, but that's a very real cost, and you're going to want to make sure you have money saved for that. And so I would recommend making kind of your own spreadsheet that is just direct costs and then everything else that you expect to have. Another example, we don't charge for books. So where you see books and supplies, that's really just supplies. Books are included in tuition. So that's somewhere where there can be kind of some differences as well. So net price is a good idea to give you kind of like ballpark, and a good way to kind of compare costs between schools, but there are going to be some kind of variances there as well. The last piece that I'll mention, which I kind of briefly talked on, but just to share a little bit more. So merit-based scholarships, it can vary whether there are different applications for these. I feel like much of the time you're automatically considered, but it can vary. Sometimes you will find a different application, maybe within the portal you get after you submit your Common App, something like that. The eligibility for them can also vary. Sometimes they're purely academic. Sometimes they are considering like involvement, leadership, different pieces like that. So I think a good question to ask is kind of what the amounts of the scholarship are, but also the percent of students that are receiving them. That's another place where you can see kind of a big variation. We give about just over 30% of our admitted students merit scholarships. There's some schools similar to us, or schools that students are often applying to. There's some of them give zero merit, and some of them give 95% of their students merit. And so you'll see some kind of variability within there. So knowing about the amounts, also knowing about the renewal criteria. So I shared before that there's often a signed agreement that goes with these. Make sure to look at that closely and understand kind of a couple things. One, is it for all 4 years? And if so, what are the criteria that I need to keep that? The other thing to kind of pay attention to is whether it's for a dollar amount or whether it's for a percentage. If it's for a percentage, it's going to change kind of as the years go on. Tuition will probably continue to increase as it has, where a dollar amount's going to stay flat, but a percentage is going to continue to kind of hold more value as each year goes on. Most of the time, if you've applied or you're considered, you're automatically kind of awarded it, and it might be in your offer of admission or in your aid package. But I always kind of recommend it doesn't hurt to ask. So after you're admitted, if you don't receive merit, and it's somewhere that it gives a decent amount of merit. If there's a school where they only give 10 students a scholarship, then they're probably not going to have a great explanation. But if it's somewhere that gives a decent amount, and you think academically after talking with your counselor or looking in Maya yourself, like if you think you're in the range, then ask. There may be an appeal process. There may be an opportunity for secondary consideration. You may get the answer of no. That's very possible too. But I would say for all parts of this process, it never hurts to ask for for additional consideration or additional aid. And so that brings me to just kind of some final takeaways, which these are random, but just things that I was thinking that didn't kind of neatly fit in on a slide. And so to continue from the merit conversation, it's to don't hesitate to ask. We have right up on our website 5 or 6 different appeal forms, and some of them are for when families have different circumstances. So they might have medical bills or job loss or something like that. Some of them also, though, are just because we're not affordable. And so we welcome a student to appeal and just say, like, the numbers aren't working out. And we can't always give a good answer, but it'll have one of our aid counselors sit down, look at it, and see, is there a gap? Could we give a little more? Is there something we were missing in the original calculation? So don't hesitate to ask or consider an appeal, as long as you're open to the fact that it might not always be a positive response. Hopefully you could see kind of in some of the calculations what I shared, there's a significant amount of financial aid out there. And so while the net price calculator is a good tool to kind of figure out who's in range, I would encourage you to not rule out a school just based on the sticker price. It's oftentimes some of the more expensive schools are the ones that have the more generous financial aid packages. And so kind of looking at that available information. And then just to kind of recap some things that were already shared. No two schools are the same, kind of as far as their requirements go, their due dates, their policies. So make sure to kind of stay on top of that and know what applications you need. Get those usernames and passwords ready now. Know when the applications are due. Don't submit them late. I mean, we'll always kind of work with you. We're not trying to penalize students, but sometimes there is a limited pool of funds and we just divide it up and then are done. And so make sure you're staying on top of it, as the aid and admission process it's concurrent. It's not something that happens after the admission process. Lastly, I would encourage you to involve your student in this. It can be tricky. It's the best word I can come up with right now. It's oftentimes a point where you're maybe sharing sensitive information that you haven't in the past, and there's ways to kind of like keep that or cushion that, but letting your student know that you're doing the application, what the steps are. They're eventually years 2, 3, and 4. They're going to be the ones getting all the reminders, getting the financial aid sessions in the student center, and so I think if you continue to kind of involve them with it, it'll really help as for kind of a life skill, but also for years 2 through 4. It'll also help kind of the conversation when it comes to April and you're comparing packages everywhere, that the financial side of this process isn't a surprise. It's not something that needs to just rule out a school at the end, but having a conversation about kind of what can our family afford, what do we need out of financial aid to make something reasonable, and doing it in vague, not vague, but broad terms that you feel comfortable with. A lot of times I'll see a lot of kind of like hurt and disappointment when a student isn't thinking about this part until towards the end of the process. So even just kind of introducing the idea earlier on with the application process can go a long way. So that's a 30,000 foot, I think is the term they use, intro to financial aid, and hopefully folks are still awake and with us, but it's not the most exciting, but it's a very important part of this process. And so I would certainly welcome if you have any questions or anything about the financial aid process. Please feel free to put those in the chat, or Tony or Mandy, I don't know if you want people unmuting, whatever, however you feel best. Glad to hear that. Excellent. Hopefully there's some, maybe, or if not, that's fine too. What I'll say, just to kind of give a few moments. If anyone's typing, please continue to. But if there aren't any questions, that's also fine. What I'll say that I think oftentimes isn't understood. Right now, there are, so like our staff right now, I mean, I'm currently sitting in a hotel in the Berkshires of Massachusetts doing this. Like, tomorrow I'm visiting a bunch of high schools, and admission staff do that. Like, my staff this year, we're visiting about 950 high schools, and so the admission staff are oftentimes the ones who kind of students make a connection with, understandably so. But oftentimes you have assigned to you a financial aid counselor. Um, and that person doesn't always seem to be as recognized, and I don't mean from a recognition standpoint, but as a resource. Definitely ask kind of at schools that you're looking at, especially around admitted student time, who is that person that you could direct questions to. I'll also, some of our aid staff would kill me if they heard me say this, but I'll let you know, like right now and for the next like 4 weeks is their slow period. All the new students have started, all the financial aid has dispersed. There's no one applying. Well, people are applying, but they're not doing anything for admission. This is their slow time. So if you want to have a conversation in general, specifics, I'll tell you, aid people usually won't go into specifics without the forms in front of them. They're very cautious on that, understandably so. But if you just want to talk to a financial aid counselor, these next 4 weeks are a great time to call a local school near you. You can call Providence; they'll talk to you, even if you aren't considering us. But really, kind of use them as a resource. I would recommend that. But it looks like we're good on questions. So I didn't know, Tony or Mandy, if you had anything to wrap up, or if we're just good to conclude.
I mean, this was amazing. Thank you so much, Owen. Do you have anything, Tony? If anybody does have questions, you can always feel free to email us too, and we can get you in contact with Owen as well.
No, this was great, Owen. Thank you so much. And we really appreciate your time and energy and effort. And go Friars.
Go Friars. Have a great night, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.